Global industries are actively searching for graduates who can tackle massive environmental and sustainability challenges. They need dynamic problem solvers who are capable of building viable businesses around those solutions. Yet, a look inside a typical high school science class reveals an environment designed over a century ago. Students sit quietly while a teacher lectures at the front of the room, transferring formulas from a whiteboard to a notebook. It is a linear, passive experience that rarely trains young adults to think on their feet. Research reveals that Indonesian students generally exhibit significant weaknesses in creative thinking, often citing chemistry as an abstract, confusing subject. This lack of engagement aligns with a broader national trend, a shortage of indigenous entrepreneurs that leaves youth unemployment and poverty rates stubbornly high. This is Manado, a coastal city in North Sulawesi, Indonesia. Here, researchers gathered 110 high school students for an experiment designed to rewrite that educational operating system. The thesis was straightforward. To fix the modern classroom, educators had to execute a simultaneous dual upgrade. They needed to change exactly what the students were learning and exactly how they were learning it. Upgrade 1 tackled the curriculum itself. Instead of using generic textbook examples, the researchers introduced ethnochemistry. This is the practice of studying the traditional, indigenous scientific knowledge of a specific local culture. In Manado, that meant looking directly at the local tradition of harvesting sap from palm trees. The community ferments this sap to create a traditional drink called saguer, which is then distilled into a local alcohol known as captikus. The students were tasked with applying the strict principles of green chemistry to this ancient practice. They analyzed the indigenous distillation process and calculated the atomic efficiency of the fermentation happening inside these traditional clay furnaces. Then the students moved from analysis to engineering. Using local resources like coconut oil and hand-sorted clothes, they harnessed natural antibacterial properties to synthesize their own soaps and hand sanitizers. The typical high school desk setup vanished. The classroom transformed into an active production lab where centuries-old traditions were rigorously tested against modern sustainability standards. By grounding chemistry in local tradition, the researchers provided a contextual bridge for the students. They weren't just memorizing formulas, they were interacting with information they already knew from their own lives and expanding it through a scientific lens. But changing the curriculum was only half the equation. Upgrade 2 replaced the traditional lecture format with Scrum, an Agile project management framework originally built for elite software development teams. The traditional top-down hierarchy was dismantled. The teachers stepped back to act as the product owner, simply setting the goals, while students organized into self-managing teams led by a peer Scrum Master. To maintain accountability, the teams relied on a product backlog and a Scrum board. Every student's contribution became completely transparent to the rest of the group. The actual work was broken down into short, intense work cycles called sprints, designed to force teams to iterate quickly within a tight deadline. During a cycle, students conducted sprint visits. Teams would physically leave their own stations to observe other groups, cross-pollinating ideas and actively critiquing each other's chemistry products. At the end of a cycle, the students held a sprint retrospective. They paused to reflect on their internal collaboration, identifying workflow bottlenecks, and figuring out how to operate more efficiently during the next round. By implementing Scrum, the researchers effectively turned a high school chemistry class into a simulated startup environment. The students actively practiced real-world project management, building the daily habits required to run a business. To measure the impact of this dual upgrade, researchers compared the experimental Scrum and ethnochemistry group against a control group that learned through a standard scientific approach. This chart displays the endgain for creative thinking. The experimental group achieved a 43.49% increase, heavily outperforming the control group's 26.24%. We see a similar trend in entrepreneurial attitudes. The Scrum group saw a 26.2% improvement, doubling the traditional classroom's 12.52% gain. Those relative gains are substantial. However, the researchers noted a catch. The absolute scores for the experimental group still fell into the moderate effectiveness category. The system worked, but it hit a very human limit. The students experienced heavy cognitive overload. Mastering advanced green chemistry, adopting a foreign project management framework, and developing entrepreneurial skills all at the same time placed an enormous mental strain on novice learners. The data proves that we can successfully upgrade the educational operating system, but to maximize effectiveness, that complexity has to be phased in gradually through iterative cycles rather than dropped on students all at once. By iterating through these cultural sprints, schools can move beyond the lecture hall. It is a model yielding students who apply chemical principles to their own communities, turning a 19th century classroom into a functional laboratory for the modern world.